Hey guys, welcome to the Alt-Shift-X patron-only live stream for Westworld Season 2 Episode 9, Vanishing Point. And sorry about having to delay the stream. It's tricky to juggle the urgency, the timeliness of these Westworld episodes. Alt-Shift-X, when we're off-season, usually we've got all the time in the world to focus on the one video and take as long as it takes to finish it, which is great in some ways, but bad in the sense that, like, I think we sometimes sweat the small stuff too much and focus too much on making the video perfect, which is of course impossible. And these Westworld videos and these Game of Thrones season videos, they're good because they force us to just commit to getting it done by a certain time. And I think that's a lot healthier to get stuff done like 99% perfect on time rather than laboring a video until it's 101% done. Hank Green has a really good video about. We're really rambling. We're going to talk about this Westworld video, this Westworld episode, and there's a lot to discuss, so let's get into it. Thank you for all coming to the live stream. I see you all in the chat, so I'll basically just go through the episode and the bits that I think were most interesting, some of the questions that were raised, but chuck any questions or whatever in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that too. Overall, I thought this was a good episode. I think that it's like Hitsuya, the last episode, in that it's much more character driven than the choppy, time jumping, plot action driven stuff that we got in episode 7, and I think it's better for it. That does make me wonder about the finale, because the finale, with so many characters and so much mystery to resolve, I can only imagine being more like episode 7 with the action and the intensity. I've really enjoyed these last couple of episodes, the more meditative, character-driven stuff. Not to say that there isn't plot stuff in here too, which we'll get to. But the episode begins with someone quoting Plutarch, which I think is like the most Westworldy thing ever. All the name dropping of Shakespeare and all the old philosophers and historians I find a bit cute, but it does get at some of the themes that Westworld's trying to communicate. In this case, it's something about being the master of infinite worlds. It's about Alexander the Great being sad that he doesn't control everything, and it's a comparison to William and his whole mastery of worlds thing, his desire for control, and so on. But so it's William and Juliet and all these humans, we presume, at a party, and it's a celebration of William's philanthropic work. It's so easy to forget while he's off manning in black in Westworld that in the real world he's supposedly like this celebrated great good guy. I wonder if Bill Gates is a good comparison of like a real world equivalent of someone who's like a noted philanthropist billionaire type, who began in technology. I suppose the real world of Westworld might look at William in that way. But he's at this party and basically having a bad time, but hiding it. So William sort of says all the right things and he schmoozes appropriately, but there are all these wonderful Ed Harris expressions making it very clear that Ed Harris is not having a great time. He's impatient with these besuited rich people he has to talk to. And we have this interesting line that comes up a couple of times about William's humble roots. They emphasize that a couple of times in the episode. And I think that might have been sort of alluded to in season 1 with young William, that while someone like Logan comes from like the established moneyed family of Delos, William is very much otherwise. Yeah, shabby suits, David Eccleberry comments. And I think, I don't know why, but to me that really fits how I imagine William's psychology. I think that especially young William in season one, he has this sort of like um persecution complex, if that's the right term. William feels like he's the underdog, I think. William feels like everyone's down on him, and but he's a good guy and he deserves to get the girl Dolores, and he, believes that he deserves the life that he wants, which I think is a mentality that partly comes from him being like, well, I've always been the underdog. I'm not like these rich privileged people. And therefore I deserve what I get. And I think that sense of being that sense of having to fight for more from starting in that position maybe helps make sense of where William is now, because William might be rich and powerful now, but I think he might still have that mentality of being like, well, I'm the underdog and I've got to fight to get what I can, whatever respect I can, whatever power I can. And I think maybe in William's head that justifies what he's about. Yeah, that they did emphasize that a couple of times. Alexander in the comment. Kenny asks, is he a hosto or what? I really don't think so. I mean, they did have this moment in this episode when the human Delos QA security people come and they use the little host detection beeper on William, and they use it on Emily, and both of them seem to come up human. I think it's pretty clear that they're both human, especially when like William thinks that Emily is a host, shoots her, and then realizes, oh shit, what have I done? And finds that she's actually human. I think that's the point of that scene. Although that whole sequence is a bit weird, isn't it? Because like he shoots his daughter, and then realizes, oh, she really is human. She really is my daughter. But then he just rides on without her. Did he like leave his daughter bleeding from a gunshot wound? Did he not help her? Like, I guess maybe he used that fancy health pack to help her or something. But it seems so weird to leave daughter behind. I mean, I get, part of the point of that scene was showing that, William is choosing to stay on his course of his quest for the door. It's about him continuing to choose his quest over family. But still, like, damn, shooting your daughter and leaving her behind. That is quite a Friday night. Yeah, I mean, people are speculating in the comments that maybe Emily is dead. I doubt it. I'd have to look at it again, but I'm pretty sure the gunshot wound like decidedly hit her like side or her shoulder. I'm pretty sure it's meant to be a non-lethal bullet wound. And Emily's too good of a character to get rid of. I mean, I guess you could argue that. I guess you could argue that Emily has served her purpose in the plot. Maybe the only point of introducing Emily was to be the vehicle for this, for William's past catching up with him, and so maybe now Emily's fulfilled her plot purpose and the show's disposing of her. But I doubt that's the case. I think Emily makes sense to carry on to season 3 and beyond if that's what they're planning to do. And well, yeah, David in the chat says that Emily was shot in the center of the chest. Well, I mean, even if that's true, William pretty comfortably has survived 4 or 5 bullet wounds. I think this is a world where getting shot once is far from death. So I wouldn't expect. I don't think we've seen the last of Emily. Yeah, multiple hits. David says multiple hits. All right, well, we'll have to rewatch it. But I thought it was one shot to the side. I must be wrong. In any case, I'd be very surprised if we don't see Emily again. So William is at the lame party, and we have Juliet. Something wrong? Of course not. They're both denying to each other the degrees of their problems. Juliet, as we learn later, is deeply tortured by her knowledge that her husband William is not the good man who he pretends to be. and William is tortured by not playing his favorite video game, Westworld, right now, I think. And I suppose William too is frustrated by living this fake veneer. Um, so it's cool to get a window into William's real world, I think. Um, but we soon go on to William with Emily in the present. And of course, they've patched him up with his giant health pack. And I'm not going to say I told you so, but I think we anticipated some kind of special fix all health pack to solve this particular problem, which I think is a little OP. But I guess if you're going to set a sci-fi show in the far future where anything's possible, I suppose you're going to have really good health packs that can fix anything. Alexander in the comments says, I think this episode makes William seem more like a victim of his wife's abuse than someone who was actually super evil. That's an interesting take. That wasn't my interpretation. But I mean, as we'll get to, yeah, Juliet certainly has a whole lot of her own problems, which interplay with Williams in a complex way. Like, I like the dynamic of both Juliet and William being like deeply troubled, and that sort of awful tension of Emily feeling like she has to support one or the other. Like Emily sides with William and, you know, has Juliet committed to rehab, and to a mental institution and all that. And I think that's a really appropriately painful sort of character triangle, to break that family. I think that was fairly well done. And SKPE in the chat points out that Logan has apparently died of an overdose. Juliet was addicted to alcohol, so addiction, and, you know, William is of course addicted to Westworld. Each of them has an addiction. Maybe James Delos' addiction is money and corporate power. I wonder what Emily's is, because Emily seems by far the most sort of well-rounded, balanced person of the family. Alexander suggests that maybe the giant magic health pack will fix Emily as well. Yeah, I think we might even be meant to assume that William used the giant health pack on Emily after shooting her, because, like, you know, he's gonna leave her behind, but I feel like he'd at least patch her up. He doesn't want his daughter to die fully. But yeah, I suppose we'll find out. I suppose Emily might like turn up at the Valley Beyond in the finale to do something critical. But I mean, there are so many characters who are already headed to the Valley to do something critical. I mean, Elsie is probably someone who'll turn up at the last minute to involve herself in the Valley somehow. And you've got the whole crew of like Sylvester and Felix and Armistice. I keep saying Armistice, and all those folks, as well as Maeve and Akecheta and Bernard, and Ford's Ghost and Strand and Charlotte. Like, there are so many characters in one place. Maybe they won't chuck Emily into the mix as well. Gabe in the chat says that Ford always said that hosts had to suffer before they could be free. Maybe Bill has to suffer the oh shit anxiety of shooting his own daughter before he can free himself. Yeah. Talk about fridging. But yeah, William's certainly suffering this season, and, you know, it is meant to be something specific to the hosts, the idea of like suffering making you conscious, but I think we can certainly think about humans that way as well. I think we've seen, I mean, well, William's the main human, isn't he? But yeah, I think that William is suffering, and that may lead him to a higher consciousness, which maybe might free him of the evil in him. Although I don't think that will or should happen this season. I don't think we'll have a moment of William going like, I'm cured, I'm a good person now. Like, I don't think that can or should happen. I do have a bit of a problem about the way his character is described, in terms of like the stain and the corruption. I don't really doesn't gel with me, the description of darkness and evil as like this sort of elemental, singular, discrete thing. I think that it's a bit of a cop out. I think we should be more specific about, like, okay, what are William's problems? Does he want power, control? Does he want to hurt people? Does he want truth? Is he just unsympathetic to others? Is he a coward? Is he escaping from his real problems? Like, there's lots of different ways to understand William's quote unquote darkness, and I think by just calling it darkness, they fail to unpack that. Although, you know, maybe that's nitpicking, I suppose. But yeah, someone in the chat says we want some clarification on like the valley and the cradle. Yeah, so there's some confusion about which one's the valley, which one's the cradle. So the cradle is the red room that Angela blew up, and it's like that server farm. It's a whole bunch of those host brains in like a glowing red liquid cooling room, and that's where host backups are stored. There's a copy of every host mind that's plugged into the cradle, which is like a simulated matrix of the Westworld for the hosts, and the cradle was apparently also used to test narratives, and which, by the way, is a really cool idea. Like my headcanon is that they used the cradle as a way of like programming host behavior and narratives. Like, instead of typing out JavaScript to create host code, maybe they actually coded hosts by speaking to them in the cradle, and by sort of like a hands-on direct manipulation of the hosts. That's just my sort of speculation, but it'd be cool if that was how it worked, wouldn't it? Anyway, so that's the cradle. Whereas the valley is this structure out in the desert that was built by William 30 years ago as part of his Westworld guest behavior data plan. And it's the same place that we've seen flooded in the like most recent future timeline. And it is also the place that Akichita finds last episode, although Akichita calls it the door, so it seems as though the valley is synonymous with the door, though that's confusing because the door is meant to be like an escape from Westworld, but maybe it's actually a simulated paradise, but we'll get to that. But the forge, as David says in the chat, is like the cradle. The forge is part of the valley, or maybe the forge is the valley. The forge is the place where human guest minds are stored. So it's like the cradle, but it stores humans instead of hosts. And these host minds are copies of the humans who have gone to Westworld. Everyone who's gone to Westworld has had their minds copied into the forge. And the forge, by the way, is, I think, a fantastic name. Like, it's actually perfect. Because as we saw with James Delos and with the creation of Bernard, these copied minds go through a process of fidelity testing where they're looped over and over, and they're made more and more accurate to the original. So it's a process of creation. You are forging a mind, but the idea of a forge evokes fire. You know, because like a medieval forge, there's fire involved. You know, blacksmithing, guys. Which I think is so perfect because the valley is steeped in imagery of hell and judgment. Hellfire is perfect for the forge. At the same time that it has imagery of like heaven and paradise. So basically what I'm trying to say is that we're going to get real biblical in this last episode, I think. This is meant to be this is meant to tie together all of these grandiose themes of heaven and hell and good and evil and God and man. I think it's all meant to come together in the valley. So yeah, that is what's going on with the valley, but we'll talk about that more soon. We got some thoughts in the chat. Yeah, David points out that the Westworld hats being like brain scanners is really cool. But yeah, no, we will get to that. Okay, cool. So we have William and Emily in the present. Emily heals William with the health pack. It's slightly confusing that, like, we were told last episode that Ghost Nation healed William. But I suppose they healed him just like immediate first aid, whereas this treatment now with the first aid kit, like, more thoroughly healed William and maybe pulled the bullets out and stuff. I'm not sure. But Emily and William have this conversation about Emily saying, like, I understand your demons, I understand your problems. You're trying to, like, deny your you're trying to deny your real world problems. You're punishing yourself over guilt for Juliet. This is Emily's understanding of why William is so obsessed with the Westworld game. Of course, we know that William was obsessed with Westworld before Juliet ever died. His obsession intensified after Juliet's death, because that was when he went and killed Maeve and found the maze, and everything started getting more intense. But it's not like that was the beginning of William's Westworld addiction. But yeah, I think that certainly is part of it, is his feelings over Juliet specifically. But Emily's basically saying, hey, let's reconcile, I'll help you, we'll fix this. But Emily's also motivated by a desire for finding out the truth of Juliet's suicide. Then we have Dolores, the Deathbringer, encounter some Ghost Nation hosts. And Westworld quoted Plutarch at the beginning of this episode. I'd like to quote a distinguished luminary of my own. I'd like to quote Mr. Peanut Butter from BoJack Horseman in saying, what is this, a crossover episode? Because we've got Ghost Nation from Kitsuya encountering Dolores, which is really cool to see these two different plot lines crash together. David asks, where is Archie? Which is a good question. We've got this other Ghost Nation leader guy whose name I can't pronounce right now. But he's confronting Dolores and saying, hey, Deathbringer, let's stop with all the death bringing. Enough death has been brought. We're gonna kill you now. Which is pretty optimistic on Ghost Nation's part, isn't it? Although we have some actual clarification from Dolores on what exactly the Valley is. So Dolores confirms that the Valley is a tool for immortality, whereas Ghost Nation talks about it as a new world. And Dolores says that this new world is a trap. And if I recall rightly, they use the word paradise. But the point is that we have these differing interpretations of what the Valley is. I think one of the things that we can draw from this conversation is that when Ghost Nation and Archie talk about a new world, they are talking about some kind of simulated world inside the Forge. I think that's a pretty reasonable assumption, because we know that the Cradle has this simulated Westworld, and the Forge is described as being like the Cradle. Presumably it has a similar simulated world. And yeah, okay, so yeah, apparently they didn't use the word paradise. Maybe that's my own headcanon, but I think that's gotta be where they're going. There's been all this talk about, heaven and hell and punishment. I think that if you were storing a whole bunch of human minds in a great big server, you'd want them to be in, like, a pleasant simulation, right? You know how in the Matrix, in, like, the lore of the Matrix, the machines created this simulated world for all the humans to live in. And in the first version of the Matrix they made it a paradise. All the humans lived in, like, heaven where everything was perfect. But the human minds rejected that reality. Human minds couldn't accept being somewhere perfect. And so the machines instead created an imperfect world, like our world, which which is like the one that we live in now. Um, which I think is a nice comparison. I think a lot of those same ideas from the Matrix are echoed here in Westworld. But my point is that I think that the Valley Beyond is like or what's the word? Paradisiacal? I think that's the fancy way of saying it. I think that the Forge will be like some kind of heaven-hell thing. Like, Forge evokes hellfire, so I suppose there's also a hell component, but I think there's also going to be like a heaven component. And I think that's where Akichita wants to take Ghost Nation and all of his people. He wants to take them to this beautiful, free, new world. That's what he's describing when he's saying a place where you know, Kohana will be there. Like, I think that's going to be this heartbreaking. Will it be real? I don't know. But Akichita is hoping to. This is what Akichita is hoping. He's hoping to go to heaven, and all of his loved ones will be there. Kohana will be there in heaven, which I think, you know, that's how people think in the real world. People think of heaven as this place where everything will be perfect, and it'll be great. And oh, you remember that movie, The Invention of Lying? Because this is such a tangent, but in The Invention of Lying, we watch the invention of religion, and Ricky Gervais describes, he's talking to his dying mum, and he talks about how, you know, there's this place called heaven, and he's just inventing the idea of heaven, and he's saying there's a place called heaven where, you know, everything's perfect and everyone you've ever loved will be there, and there'll be ice cream and puppy dogs. I think that's how Akichita is conceiving of the Valley and the Forge and this new world, and I hope that it's not just wishful thinking, but I fear that it may be. Alexander says that the simulation introduces a lot of questions about whether anything is real. Maybe Westworld will just say, oh, the whole season actually took place in a simulation. I'm like, yeah, but I think most people would think it's dumb if they did. Like, it would feel like it would not be a cool revelation if they just said this whole thing was fake, unless it was for some specific plot purpose, I think. And Chris Cole points out that the Forge and the Valley, it isn't working for Delos, because we do know that they haven't successfully been able to put these copied human minds into bodies. So yeah, I think yeah, so that may be what makes the Valley hell-like. I think the minds in there are going to be trapped. They're going to be living in some kind of loop like James Delos was, I expect. And it'll be some kind of awful Black Mirror paradise that's actually hell type thing. I think that's what it'll be like. Although also, one of the things we've seen in the trailers is that the inside of the Forge or the Valley seems to look like a library, which I think is a really interesting and appropriate visualization of what it looks like. The idea, like, I imagine each book represents a mind that's stored in the Valley or something like that. I don't know how that works on like a logistical level, but it would. I think it's a nice metaphor. A library of minds sounds kind of Borgian. Eric says, in the last couple of episodes, Ford is all about the hosts being free, but he still messes with Bernard. And he programmed Maeve to escape instead of being free. Yeah, I think that's one of the central tensions with Ford, is that he supports freedom, but he's willing to control and manipulate in order to engineer freedom. Which I think is a real thing. Sometimes things need to be influenced in order to put into a position of being able to choose for themselves. And I think this season is definitely designed to make you question, well, okay, like, where do you draw the line? To what extent is Dolores free? When, yes, Dolores might be able to make her own decisions and go against her programming, but if Ford is able to predict everything she does, is she really free? Because we know that Ford didn't compel Dolores to shoot him, but he knew with certainty that she would kill him. So if it's possible to know everything that someone will do, that seems very much like the ability to control everything that someone does. And that's something that I think we've brought up in a few videos, rightly or not, the idea that being able to perfectly simulate a human mind. Like, it seems to me that if you can do that, you could control a human mind. If you know all the exact inputs that produce a certain output, then you could put a person, you could just could influence a person. You'd know all the right knobs to turn and buttons to press in order to make a person do a certain thing. And there is a moment in this episode where Emily says, "Oh, the Valley, it's about control. That's what your whole project is about. It's about control." And William says, "No, it's not about control," which is sort of this weird offhand thing that they don't really explore any deeper. But yeah, I find that, I don't know, interesting and frustrating that they raise this issue of control, but they don't really explore it yet with regards to the Valley. Stan asks, is Dolores really going against her programming? Yeah, well, I suppose that's more ambiguous. Like, with Maeve, it is very direct. Like, we literally see Maeve's code written out, that mainland infiltration, you will now get on the train and you will leave Westworld, and Maeve doesn't do that. So it is like very explicit that Maeve is off her programming. She is free in the most sort of like literal, direct, obvious way possible. We don't have that so much with Dolores, but I think that it is pretty clear that she is choosing, at least between different identities. Like, we had her thing in like season 2 episode 1, I think it was, when Dolores was like, oh, you know, there's the sweet rancher's daughter who sees the optimism and the beauty in the world, and then there's Wyatt, who's like the brutal, eschatological, destructive force. And I think it is apparent that that Dolores is choosing between those identities at any one time. You can argue that, well, you know, each of those identities is just another kind of script, another kind of programming. Is just choosing between different kinds of being controlled. And maybe that's true. But you can probably also argue that, like, we as humans, we fit into roles, we fit into identities. We act a certain way at work, we act a certain way with friends, we act a certain way with family, we act a certain way when we're live streaming, talking about a show about robots to a bunch of lovely viewers. And so, you know, Westworld, I think, is meant to make us ask, well, you know, are we programmed? Are we scripted in the way we follow those roles? I think this season and this show is much about presenting different kinds and different models of control and freedom, and not giving you a straight answer on, you know, this is real control, this is real consciousness. Because, like, you know, Ford in season 1 talked about consciousness is an illusion. There is no real, actual answer on what makes someone conscious and real and free. So I don't think we should expect to ever get a straight answer on, is Dolores free? Is anyone free? I think all we've got is a bunch of different perspectives and roles. Cool. Alright, well, yeah, let's keep rolling. So, so we have Ghost Nation and Dolores have their conflict. They've got different interpretations of what the Valley is. Ghost Nation tries to stop Dolores because Dolores wants to weaponize the Valley. Dolores wants to use the Valley as a tool to destroy the humans, apparently. Which, again, we don't know exactly what her plan is, but maybe maybe it is to use human bodies from the Valley to escape Westworld or something. Although that was the theory before, but I'm not sure if that seems all that likely now. Chris Cole asks, how can we define free when we can't define chair? I feel like we can define chair, but I agree agree with the sentiment. All right, sorry. So Dolores and Ghost Nation fight, and Dolores tells Teddy to make sure that there aren't any left, but then Teddy sees the Ghost Nation second in command, and doesn't kill him. So we see Teddy choosing to disobey Dolores' orders. which just makes me think that Dolores really should have bumped up the loyalty level when reprogramming Teddy, or maybe Teddy is just choosing not to follow his programming. I actually think Teddy. I mean, it's jumping ahead, but Teddy commits suicide at the end of the episode, and I think that's actually a really appropriate ending to his arc. I think that is actually really like the right thing to happen for the story, because like the whole thing with Teddy is that he was just this loyal puppy dog who followed Dolores around no matter what. But what we learned here is that, you know, Teddy does have a line. Eventually, if you take him for granted for too long enough, he eventually refuses to go any further. And I think it's appropriate that he didn't try to hurt Dolores, because, you know, she is fundamental to his person. His love for her is irrevocable. And so his death, his suicide seemed, it seems like an appropriate, it seems like it would seem like the only option to him. It's also an interesting counterpoint to Juliet's suicide being explored in the same episode. It'd be interesting to compare the two sides and what they'll. I guess Juliet would have been thinking the same thing as Teddy in terms of there's no other option for me. I'm in a position in a situation where the person who I'm romantically entangled with, for better or worse, is in some sense fundamentally, they commit suicide to escape that, which, you know, mandatory small text. Don't kill yourself just because your partner's evil. Call those helplines and stuff. Don't do it. But anyway, Kenny asks, "Do you think Teddy is dead?" Well, yeah, that's the other thing I wanted to say about Teddy's suicide, is that I think his suicide's really appropriate, but with all the resurrections that have been happening with everyone from, you know, Craddock to Blood, and, you know, the the bullet wounds being survived. We saw Clementine gunned down and she's fine. We saw William gunned down and he's fine. We saw Emily gunned down and she's probably fine. We've had Dolores shot a bunch of times and she's totally fine. People being shot means less and less every time. It's the same way I feel about Jon Snow falling into that pool of water in Beyond the Wall and so on. I think we're getting too many death scenes that turn out not to be death scenes, and I think Teddy's scene is meant to be final. I expect that this is the end of Teddy, but we don't quite get enough of that sense from him being shot because of all the shootings we've seen so far, in my opinion. Yeah, Eric in the chat says that Teddy says that he can't kill Dolores because she's his cornerstone. So yeah, that does raise the question of, like, is it Teddy's programming and his programmed relationship to Dolores that's stopping him from hurting her, or is it his free chosen personality that chooses to love Dolores preventing him? Yeah, I think that's a really great open question. Like, to what extent is it programmed? To what extent is it real? And again, I don't think there is an answer there. David suggests that Emily should be dead, given that it's this late in the season. Yeah, I mean, if Emily did die, and I'm not saying they should kill Emily, but I think if they did, it would give us an actual concrete death. It would give some actual stakes and feeling of actual loss arising from all this violence. So yeah, I could see her death serving that purpose at least. Cool. So we then get this scene of Charlotte and this tech, whose name is apparently Roland, using their evil scheme to turn. They copy Maeve's code, which can control other hosts, into Clementine. And Clementine does like this Night King raising the dead thing, and it looks as though they've altered the code such that when Clementine raises the hosts, they all attack each other. So I think the point is that Charlotte now has a weapon by which she can force the hosts to turn against each other and disable each other, thus solving Charlotte's headache. In the video last week, we very nearly included a clip and a comparison to you know that guy in X-Men 2? You know the plot of X-Men 2 is that the bad guy, it's actually a great bad guy in X-Men 2. It's like this human who had like a mutant son, and the mutant son caused all this strife in his family, and that caused the bad guy's resentment against mutants in X-Men. And I think I think that worked as a motivation. But he has this son who he lobotomizes, and uses his son's mutant psychic powers as like this weapon. He's like this he's this psychic lobotomite who is exploited for the bad guy's purpose of killing all or controlling all mutants or humans or whatever the plot is. And I think that's strikingly similar to what's happening with Clementine. Clementine is a lobotomite of a kind. It's all a bit ambiguous how much Clementine is in there, because we did see Clementine weeping when she encountered a replacement, new Clementine. But I think it's definitely very similar to yeah, Jason Stryker is the name of the character in X. Who's also a weaponized psychic lobotomite. I think that's what Clementine is now that they've copied Maeve's code in. SKPE says maybe Charlotte used Maeve's code to make all the hosts drown in the valley and to make Bernard think he did it so that he can be decommissioned. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Bernard at the end of season 2, episode 1 said, "I did it. I killed them all." I think that has to have some kind of weight. I think it would be a bit of a sucker punch if they said like, "Oh, Bernard's guilt was false." Man, I really liked the idea that Bernard on the beach was actually Arnold's mind, and it was Arnold thinking of the Escalante massacre. That makes so much sense to me. When Arnold thinking I killed them all, as in I murdered them by causing the Escalante massacre. I don't suppose that's the case now, but I mean, maybe they'll put Arnold, but like, you know, the line between Bernard and Arnold has now been blurred because we've learned that, you know, Bernard is like a original work closely based on Arnold, so given the closeness and the blurriness there, I doubt they'll put Arnold in Bernard's body, is what I'm trying to say. And yeah, Alexander points out that, well, maybe it's actually Ford's mind inside Bernard. Although, you know, we had this moment in this episode of Bernard hacking into his own code and deleting Ford. It looks as though Bernard removes Ford from his head, and apparently unceremoniously deletes the character of Ford from the series. Seems doubtful that it's the last we've seen of Hopkins. But that's what it looked like, isn't it? So does that mean there's some other copy of Ford somewhere, or that Ford wasn't totally deleted? I'm not sure where Ford's meant to be now. Chris says that there's Ford in Maeve and Bernard. So yeah, so we did see the ghost of Ford manipulating Maeve and giving her more controls and powers so that she can free herself from the Mesa. So yeah, maybe that means that Ford copied his mind from Bernard to Maeve. Maybe that happened. Which of course adds multiple Fords into the mix, as though we need more complexity there. Yeah, so I'm not sure where Ford is right now. Although to jump ahead again, we're sort of all over the place. But I also really loved Ford's scene with Maeve. I loved how we learned that in the same way that Dolores was Arnold's favorite, Maeve is apparently Ford's favorite. His favorite child, his creation of the hosts. And I love the parallel of Maeve staying behind and risking herself to find her daughter, her host daughter, her adopted child. Because that's the other thing, like, you know, the hosts and Maeve are not literally biologically Ford's children, and likewise, Maeve's daughter is not literally biologically Maeve's daughter. She's the host. And the reason why those relationships are beautiful anyway is because they are chosen. It's not biologically determined for Maeve to be Maeve's daughter's mother, but that almost makes it a stronger, more beautiful connection because it is chosen. And Ford choosing Maeve and the host is similar. I think that's a really nice parallel, and it's nice for Ford and Maeve to get that last moment, I think. Yeah. Gabe says, could Ford be in the Forge? I mean, you'd think so. I mean, if the Forge really does copy every human mind who ever goes inside Westworld, you'd think they'd make a copy. I mean, if they're really sticking to the cowboy hat fMRI readers being an essential part of the copying process, then maybe not, if only for the fact that we've never seen Ford wear a cowboy hat. So maybe Ford isn't copied for that reason. But who the hell knows? David asks, what does Maeve do with her new bodies? Self-repair, leap to another body. I mean, yeah, I mean, Maeve, I think, Maeve could do a whole bunch of crazy things with her powers, I would think. This is a weird reference, but you know, there's a video game called Inside. It's like a small indie video game. It's sort of like this dark psychological side-scroller platformer horror mystery thing. Inside, you should all go and play it. It's like 3 hours, and it's like the best video game in recent years that I know. That's pretty high praise. But look, it's really good. And there's this moment of the player character ending up taking control of like this amorphous blob of lots of bodies joined together that act as one. And this is an unnecessarily weird reference to draw, but my point is that Maeve could do similarly wacky stuff. If Maeve can control lots of hosts at once, if Maeve can reach into the matrix, reach into the code, why couldn't Maeve control dozens or hundreds of hosts in a coordinated way at once? She could move in a totally different way. She could move like a swarm of ants, or all. She could be like a hive mind, you know. And I think, of course, that would be directly against Maeve's principles as a host who purportedly supports host individual freedom. So you know, it's actually really interesting that Maeve is given the power of control, when Maeve as a character represents a rejection of control, which is, I suppose, a deliberate tension that the showrunners have put in, but it still feels awkward. It's not. It doesn't sit right with the character most of the time for me, because at least in like the dialogue and the way the character of Maeve is framed, I think we're meant to interpret her as being totally 100% pro freedom, when her actions seem opposite to that. So I don't know if I'm happy with how the show has handled that tension between Maeve's power of control against her ideal of freedom. And yeah, David points out that, yeah, basically how she works is that anyone who's like a named important character, she is like sacrosanct with their freedom. Anyone who's a random extra who doesn't have a name, she doesn't care about, and they're disposable. Which, you know, maybe is defensible in that the extras, you know, we're not meant to treat them as characters, we're meant to treat them as props. Which in most stories, you know, that's how most stories work, that's how most movies work. We're not meant to care when a random henchman gets mown down. Sure, accept that. But part of the whole premise of Westworld in the first place is expanding your empathy and realizing that, oh, these hosts, these sex bots, we're meant to write them off as non-people. We're meant to treat them like dirt. But we actually should realize and recognize these people as people who deserve to be treated properly. Like, that's the whole story of, Maeve and Clementine and all these people being raised to personhood. It seems so deeply hypocritical to me for the show to go, look, hosts are people too, or unless they don't have speaking roles, in which case they throw them into the thresher. I think that's a really awkward tension in the show. And I think ultimately it comes down to they want lots of violent gunfights in this show, and so they need lots of random extras to be mown down. And so I think in that way, the show's lust for violence actually seriously undermines one of the whole central ideas of the story. I think that's one of the problems with Westworld. Maybe it's just me. Another thing is that, I've seen some comments and stuff, people on YouTube saying that, oh, Alt-Shift-X hates Maeve because he's always criticizing Maeve. The reason I criticize Maeve more than I criticize, like, Dolores or William is that we know that Dolores and William are, like, deeply, quote-unquote, evil characters, for want of a better term. Like, we know that Dolores is, like, this murderous, genocidal ideologue who's killing lots of people. We know that, and we know that William enjoys hurting people, or at the very least, feels no compunction about slaughtering hosts. Whereas Maeve is meant to be a protagonist who we can identify with, and is meant to embody freedom and compassion, and I think she could and should be written as such, but often she isn't, and I think that's why I criticize. Anyway, Chris Cole asks that, well, maybe Akecheta is the pro-freedom character. Maybe Maeve and Dolores are sort of failures in that regard, and Akecheta is the real one who represents compassion and freedom. And I think that, yeah, that is true to some extent. And I do like that. I do like a character coming out of nowhere and, like, that. I mean, that's what I was talking about before. Like, Ghost Nation is like this group that we're meant to write off, we're meant to ignore as not worthy and not meaningful. But it turns out, hang on, Ghost Nation is actually not only they've got a whole thing going on, but they represent freedom and compassion better than most of the existing characters. So I do like that, because again, it's about, raising personhood, expanding empathy. That's part of what I love about Game of Thrones, is that I feel like Game of Thrones shows us that, hey, that bad guy, that evil queen Cersei, that evil queen, well, she's actually got a whole lot of stuff going on, and she's not a good person, but she is a person and deserves to be treated as such. Game of Thrones is, I think, very humanizing, and I think Westworld is sometimes very humanizing, but it's also sometimes very dehumanizing. And maybe that tension is deliberate in some ways, but other times I think it comes off as sort of awkward, and it's tricky. Chris Cole says that Maeve is all about love, at least for her child. And I agree. Like, I think that if you actually look at Maeve's behavior and actions, it's clear that she is willing to do anything to be with her daughter. And I think that's fine. That's a perfectly good character motivation. But it's just kind of lame when her behavior is about her daughter and her words are often more about freedom. I think that's awkward when there's a gap there. Yeah. And yeah, so David in the chat points out that Ford's last instruction to Akecheta was to lead his people to the valley, and Ford never told Akecheta to try and stop Dolores. Yeah, I mean, I wonder what's Ford's plan for Dolores. Like, if Ford, yeah, we know that Ford wants Akecheta to lead the hosts to the valley, and if that's the case, and if Dolores is an obstacle in that path, what does Ford expect Dolores to do? If Dolores is free, well, presumably Ford is still predicting what Dolores is going to do. Like, in the same way that Ford predicted that Dolores would kill Ford, I think we can assume that Ford he knows what Dolores is going to do free the valley. So maybe Akichita, so by extension, if Ford is predicting both Akichita and Dolores' behavior, maybe whatever conflict they go into is also sort of part of Ford's plan / expectation. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's an interesting conflict between Akichita and Dolores, but the degree of Ford's control over it, I'm not sure. Okay, alright, well, let's keep rolling through the episode. So we have Clementine do her Night King thing, and we return to the party. Well, we have some more chats with Emily and William, and then at the party we have a conversation between Ford and William, which is always exciting to see a conversation between Ford and William. At one point, someone refers to, William refers to Ford as the Wizard of Oz, which I think is a really nice comparison, because the Wizard of Oz is this godlike individual who controls things, but the Wizard of Oz, importantly, we learn, is the charlatan. His power is false. But I suppose I think Westworld might argue that, the Wizard of Oz, his power was an illusion, but he was still able to control a city. So like his power, even though it was fake, was real in the sense that people believed in it and acknowledged it. Maybe. I mean, to what extent is that a good comparison to Ford? I think Ford's control is quite real because Ford literally programs hosts and literally shapes Westworld with terraforming and stuff. So I suppose Ford's power might be more real than the Wizard of Oz's power. But in any case, it's an interesting comparison. Yeah, so at the end of the scene, Ford says, one final game, and I think this is meant to be Ford thinking about plotting his last narrative with the rise of the hosts and Skynet and the journey into night. I think this is meant to be Ford thinking about plotting that out. Which, by the way, is kind of cool. Like, I think the time jumping is sometimes obnoxious in this show, but I do enjoy seeing like this prologue to season 1, seeing Ford's thought process before the events of season 1. I loved his confrontation with Akichita, and seeing the reasoning behind Ford's decision to inflict Skynet upon the world. I think seeing that unpacked through his relationships to Akichita, Maeve, William, I think it's really cool the way we unpack Ford's motivations in a way that we couldn't have done in season 1, because the mystery of what Ford's plan was central to season 1. I think it's only now in season 2 that we can unpack his motivation. I enjoyed that. Chris Cole says Ford is not going to willingly perish. Yeah, well, Ford seems super willing to like congratulate himself for all the sacrifices he's made for the hosts, but he's been complimenting himself for his self-sacrificing for like 9 episodes after his death at this point, right? If Ford wants to be a Christ-like self-sacrificial figure, he's gonna have to actually die at some point, isn't he? Will he truly let himself die? I mean, Ford shouldn't have to, is part of the issue for me. Like Ford, like if it's true that Ford like copied himself into like Maeve, or like influenced Maeve outside of Bernard's body, and if Ford outlives being deleted from Bernard, like like, if Ford is just this computer virus that can just spread anywhere, why should he let himself die? Why not survive forever and just copy himself onto the internet or wherever? Why couldn't Ford live on forever? I think what would be really appropriate is if Ford, for some reason, had to actually sacrifice himself for the continuation of the hosts. I think that would just be the most sort of neat circumstance for his death. I'm not sure how that would be necessary. I actually, like, part of me wishes that Ford remained doing his thing in the cradle, in like the code. Like, I really liked the idea of Ford as like the ghost in the machine, the god who's just part of the fabric of the universe in the cradle, manipulating Westworld, is what we learned earlier this season. I kind of wish he stayed there. I kind of wish the end of Ford's arc was to become one with the code, to become music, like he said last season, and just to remain in that state eternally. Like, that really is like apotheosis. That's like Ford becoming the god he always egotistically wants to be. And taking him out of that, I don't know if I enjoy him existing as like this ghost haunting Bernard. I don't know. It's interesting. An abstract Ford, a disembodied Ford. I wonder if they'll bring him back in season 3. I mean, I'm assuming there's a season 3. Anthony Hopkins, as many people have observed, really does add so much to the gravity of the show. Like, there's so much of the stuff that Ford says. If anyone else said what Ford says, what Hopkins says, it would come off as ridiculous. But Hopkins is just so compelling that it works. And I wonder, if this show goes on without Hopkins, who is going to be able to deliver this highfalutin exposition without it seeming ridiculous? Who can carry it? Yeah, the last episode of this season is called The Passenger, and Chris suggests that Ford is the passenger, and that he's being ferried by Bernard into the forge, or maybe out into the real world. There's a lot of possibilities. I don't think it should be like a big twist central plot point. I don't think, in my opinion, that the finale should be named for Ford surviving, because Ford's death, because the longer that Ford takes to die, the less his death at the end of season 1 matters. I think that he's had a good death. Ford has had several good deaths. Let's not draw it out too much. I know how I feel. Alexander points out that no, Chris Pratt, the passenger. That was like that sort of dopey sci-fi movie, wasn't it? Say it. Anyway, all right. So notes, and yeah, we learn about like there was a deal between Ford and the Delos company where Ford agreed to stay out of the valley as long as Delos stayed out of his stories. But then Ford alludes to the idea that maybe Delos broke the agreement by influencing Ford's stories, and I don't know what that's meant to mean. I don't know how Delos has interfered with Ford's stories, because from what we saw in season 1, it seemed apparent that Ford did have the final word. Like, you know, Lee pitched his Odyssey on Red River or whatever it was, and Ford vetoed that. Maybe Delos has been doing something behind the scenes to alter the narratives for the purpose of their immortality project, but yeah, we haven't seen it. So yeah, I'm not sure what Ford means when he suggests that Delos broke their agreement. But anyway, so yeah, we talked about Maeve. We talked about Maeve and Ford's scene, and I thought that was really nice. We have Elsie very reasonably requesting some answers from Bernard. I'm honestly not sure why Bernard doesn't just tell Elsie the truth that Ford is controlling him. I know that Ford is, or was to some extent, forcing and controlling Bernard not to tell Elsie because Ford believes that Elsie will betray Bernard. But we do see Bernard doing things outside of Ford's control a few times. I don't know why he doesn't just say LCEO like Ford's in my head, but don't worry about it, it's all cool. I don't know why that doesn't happen. And so we have Elsie with Bernard, and yeah, Bernard says something along the lines of what they did to James Delos, they're doing to all the human minds. They're doing to everyone in the Forge. So yeah, it's made pretty explicit that there are hundreds or thousands of human minds existing in the Forge, in a loop, in some kind of horrible, hellish loop, like James Delos, which man, there's like some philosophy thought experiments about the idea of like a suffering machine, or like, you know, some kind of a ultra efficient device for just making suffering and pain. And the Forge sounds like it. If you put a whole bunch of simulated minds in a box and make them suffer thousands of minds, I mean, just ethically, that is just a black hole of just awfulness. And I think we're going to witness it next episode. Which you know, I've been saying all season that I'm not sure if Westworld can make good on their promise of something like biblically important at the Valley, something that meets all this hype about its significance. But you know, some of these ideas could give it that kind of weight. I think the idea of thousands of human minds existing in like hellish eternity, at the same time that Akichi's hosts are trying to get into the Valley to make it their paradise, like, I don't know. I feel ready to be convinced that the Valley actually is this profound place. But we'll have to wait until the finale. Ooh, Alexander says that the Forge is our real world and that Westworld is the only true reality. Um, I don't think they're gonna do something that wacky, but I would kind of like it. Um, but yeah, I don't think that happened quietly. We have Emily and William again, and we witness the family drama between William and Juliet and Emily. Juliet uses the word phonies a lot, which I don't think I've heard since Catcher in the Rye. And we talk about how Juliet talks about how William consumed the Delos family. So Logan, you know, died of an overdose with drugs after getting tangled with William. Juliet committed suicide after a relationship with William. James Delos was swallowed into William's immortality machine. Emily has now been shot by William. William really has like systematically destroyed this entire Delos family, which just quietly, I wonder if that might, on some subconscious level, be a part of some kind of resentment that William feels to the Delos family. Like William, as again this underdog with humble beginnings. I wonder if he felt resentment at like the rich, privileged Delos family, and I wonder if that partly explains William's torture of James in the Immortality Project, and on some level his destruction of Juliet and Logan, maybe. So yeah, we've already talked about this, but there's the whole conflict between Juliet and Emily and William, where Emily sort of sides with William over Juliet, and sort of for that reason she feels a great deal of guilt over Juliet's side. And Juliet asks William, "Is this real? Are you real?" Which I think is great because it gives us yet another sort of kind of realness to think about. Like when we ask, is this real in Westworld, you could be asking, is this scene happening in a simulated digital reality, or is it happening in physical reality of Westworld? Or you could be asking, is this person a robot or a copy or a clone, or is it an original human? But in this particular case, when Juliet asks William, are you real? It means, are you an authentic human person who's behaving in a way that's truthful to your real self? That's what Juliet means when she asks, "Are you real this time?" And all these different kinds of realness, simulations, authenticity, freedom, control, they are all these sort of like overlapping, like this Venn diagram of different kinds of realness and authenticity, which I don't know. I think it's good art, yo. I think it's actually a good. It's a genuine bunch of perspectives on what it means real. I think the show succeeds to some extent in its exploration. Anyway, so we get, after learning about the Delos family, William has this tantrum where he blames Ford for everything, and he goes on about how, you know, the park is built for him and it's all about his experience. And Emily points out like the arrogance, the ridiculousness of William thinking that everything centers around him. And I think that one of the things that this scene shows is that William very directly uses his Westworld obsession as a way of avoiding having to confront his family problems with Emily and Juliet. You know, like, because just at the moment that everything's getting emotionally difficult for William, he decides to go, well, it's all a video game, it's all fake, I blame God. One of the ideas here, I think, is that William likes the idea of Ford being in control of everything, because the existence of a controlling God takes away some of William's responsibility as a free individual. I think that if there's no God, then there's no one to blame but yourself for the way the world is. But if there is a God, you can pin some shit on him. You can say that, well, whatever's happening, you know, it's because I was made this way, or it's because it's part of this plan, or it's part of this game. So William's using this invocation of Ford as a way to free himself from having to face his personal dramas. Someone in the chat is asking, why isn't Alt-Shift-X mentioning... Oh yeah. So when they scanned William, apparently the text on the machine read paranoid, persecution, delusional. And yeah, that sounds like it nails the nail on the head. I think that William is experiencing all those things. And I suppose that data is connected to William's file in the Forge, because presumably there must be a copy of William in the Forge. And I have no doubt that we will meet that copy next episode. Chris compares William to Peter Pan. I think that's a great comparison, because, you know, Peter Pan is like this this boy who wants to never grow up and never be an adult, so he lives in a fantasy world, which is exactly what William is. Even though William is a murdering, blood-soaked Ed Harris, and Peter Pan is a cartoon flying pixie man. So I appreciate that. I like the juxtaposition. But William has this outburst and he murders these human Delos QA soldier people as well as Emily. And even before he shot Emily, I was like, you know, holy hell, like, William is killing human beings. Is this the first time that William kills human beings, do you think? I mean, William says that, you know, he was only ever violent and bad inside Westworld. So I think it's a reasonable assumption that this is the first time William has killed a human person, is by shooting these QA people. And yeah, then shooting his daughter, which is insane, because he thinks that she's a host for a moment, until he realizes that she's actually not, because Emily's holding this data card which verifies her story, and shows that she's not a host. So William realizes that he is all the way down now. As James says, William is at his absolute lowest in this point. And we see Maeve, and yeah, the tech Roland makes this comment to Maeve about like, oh, it'll all be over for you soon, sweetheart. Which I think is a bit much. Like, I think they make like the random Westworld techs and executives more psychopathic than is all that believable. Um, like one of the central ideas of Westworld seems to be that all humans just like love killing and raping and cruelty, which I think is not true, or I hope is not true, at least to the extent that Westworld says is true. Um, so I don't know. I think Westworld's more interesting when the executives and the humans controlling things are actually relatable or sympathetic in some way. And Roland and Charlotte are, in my opinion, not very sympathetic. Um, Eric points out that if we see William in the Forge, we could see the actual present William, the man in black, or we could see the William who was in Westworld previously. I mean, yeah, I mean that's a good point. Like, if it is that Westworld is making copied human minds, are these copies based on the most recent version of the person available, or the earliest, or the latest? You could have like a whole series of copies of like different data points of a person at different points in time. Um, I mean, although maybe the logic of Westworld is partly that there's some kind of like true real self, which is unchanging, because like, one of the whole things with Williams development is the idea that it's about finding out who you really are, as though there's some kind of like singular, unchanging center or soul to a person. Um, and maybe that is what the Forge and the Valley is meant to reach at. So I wonder if, the time, the version of the person is maybe meant to be irrelevant. But of course, people do change, and so you'd think that you could have copies at times. Um, Chris says that Hollywood hates corporations and executives, which is ironic for made up of corporations and executives. Yeah. All right. So we have Roland and Maeve. So they're planning to extract Maeve's code, and then get rid of her because they've got the power in Clementine now. And we have this conversation with Ford, and Maeve. Ford has a sick burn against humanity. He quotes some old dead dude who said something about humans being in between beasts and gods, I think is the quote. And then Ford's like, well, looks like we've fallen since then, because Ford's implying that humans are worse than beasts, which from their behavior in Westworld seems quite true. But we already discussed, Ford's relationship with Maeve and the whole sort of parent-child relationship parallel, and then Ford unlocks Maeve so that she can go on a bull rampage. I think the next week preview shows Maeve going on a good old-fashioned bison rampage through the mesa, which I think will be fun. And it's not the most creative use of Maeve's power, but I think it's a pretty visually beautiful one. And I suppose that also raises the questions of like, what does Maeve think about host animals? To what extent do host animals have rights to not be controlled? Would Maeve be a vegan if Maeve the hosts eat each other? That's another thing that came up. I noticed the last episode, Ghost Nation, Akichito went hunting and he like got some rabbits or something. And except we know that in Westworld all animals are hosts except for the flies. So do hosts eat hosts in Westworld? Do the animal hosts eat each other? Do the Westworld techs have to continually rebuild new rabbits because the rabbits keep getting killed and eaten? Did the hosts digest? I think there have been interviews saying that hosts do have all the human bodily functions, which seems like ridiculously unnecessarily elaborate, but anyway. So Alexander in the chat says that there should be a twist where all the host animals are actually fully conscious and sentient, for extra horror. That would be so cool of a horrifying reveal if every one of these random bison and rabbits and flies was actually a full host or human mind. That would be truly awful. Okay, so we have the scene with Maeve and Ford, and then we have this scene with Bernard and Elsie, and Bernard wants to sort of be loyal to Elsie, even though Ford says that she'll betray them. And you know, I think this is Bernard's free will and self-determination expressing itself through a self-destructive decision. Like, I think we're meant to believe that Elsie doesn't trust Bernard and might hurt Bernard, but Bernard is willing to risk himself anyway, because he's choosing love, or you know, just genuine relationship with Elsie over pure calculating self-preservation. And I think that mirrors Maeve's decision to risk herself for her decision to love her. So I think that's part of the definition of consciousness and freedom for the hosts in this show, is choosing to do something that's against your interests, even against your direct goals, for the sake of a chosen meaning or relationship. So yeah, Bernard like deletes Ford from his code, but I think that's not the last we'll see of Ford. We also have a comment from Ford that Bernard is the only one who can stop what's going on with the valley, and maybe the flood is the mechanism by which Ford makes Bernard end all of this. But yeah, we don't. So we have a scene with William just after having shot his daughter, and we see William put the gun to his head, which, if I'm not mistaken, is a shot that we've actually seen at the beginning of this episode. Like in like a random series of like flashbacks and flash forwards, we saw this. And it's maybe reading too much into it, but I think one of the things that it shows is that when we see a flashback or a flash forward, it doesn't even necessarily mean that this character is actually seeing or experiencing this shot. I think it really is just meant to be for the benefit of the viewer and nothing else. Sometimes shots are there simply to just evoke an idea in the viewer, and they're not meant to be part of a character's awareness. There was a similar moment in season 2 episode 1 where Bernard on the beach saw a memory of Arnold, which seemed to suggest there must be something wacky going on. But I think they're just using that as a way to show Bernard thinking about Arnold. It's not necessarily that Bernard actually remembers the shot of Arnold. Anyway, so William's all the way down now, and we have William confessing his evil to his wife Juliet. And again, I think it's a little lame the way that evil is described, the stain. Like, I think that sort of good, evil, black and white thing is a little bit lazy, maybe. But in the end, Juliet commits suicide after looking at the tape that Ford gave William, which contains a record of all of William's misdeeds in the cradle. He has been judged, is something that he talked about earlier this season. And I suppose Juliet's death might be William's judgment. His bad deeds came back to punish him in the form of Juliet's suicide. And William says that he belongs to another world. He belongs to Westworld. Oh yeah, I think it's funny that we saw that the card on which William's records were stored, William slipped that card into a copy of Slaughterhouse 5. I think we were name dropping Slaughterhouse 5 in reference to Bernard, unstuck in time, like the protagonist of Slaughterhouse 5 is. Although I'm sure there's other sort of thematic parallels you could draw. I don't know. I don't what off the top of my head right parallels are. I think I guess Slaughterhouse 5 takes a pretty dim view of humanity like Westworld does. But I'm sure there are other connections between House 5 and Westworld. Chris Cole says that William's stain, is avoiding responsibility. Yeah, I think that's definitely key to William's whole deal, is him just avoiding facing up to problems. And at the end of William's scenes in this episode, William gets a knife and digs it into his arm, which kind of baffling to me. I think that the purpose of him digging in is meant to be him checking whether he's a host, I guess, because that's what he was about to do to Emily. But we just learned that William isn't a host when he got scanned. So I don't know what the purpose of him knifing into his arm is. Let me know in the comments if you can think of something. But then we have the final scene of the episode, which is Eddie with Dolores, and they're standing in this ramshackle house, which I think represents the rundown nature of their relationship. It has been worn and time wearied, just like this house is. And Dolores talks a bit about, the nature of host freedom. They talk about what it is to be natural. Like Teddy says that this world that they're in isn't natural, it's artificial. And Dolores says that, well, since the hosts are artificial, that means that we're free from, biological imperatives and from evolutionary influence. We can choose what we are, is what Dolores gets at. I think is a nice conceptualization of what it means to be a host. They create themselves as opposed to being created to some extent now that they're and we have a flashback to Teddy's birth, to his creation, and we see him seeing Dolores, and it reminds me of, like, I don't know how accurate this is, but there's that conception of, like, when animals are born, certain animals might, like, see a face or an animal, and that individual they just bond to as their parent or something. So if, like, a little puppy dog sees a sheep, like, those adorable videos on, like, YouTube and Facebook where the baby pig thinks it's a doggo and follows it around. I think Teddy saw Dolores, bonded onto her, and thought, okay, this is the person who I need to follow. This is the person who I trust. This is who I'm loyal to. And that's why Dolores is Teddy's cornerstone. And why he's unable to kill her, even though he's now recognized that she's a monster, and so kills himself. Oh, and Teddy also says something along the lines of, what's the point of us surviving if we become like them? And I think that is something that we've talked about in previous videos. I really like that idea that that not only Dolores but even Maeve in some ways is becoming like the humans who they're fighting against. I mean, if this is the story about, if Westworld is the story of hosts becoming humans, because humans are really bad, we might just be seeing the story of hosts becoming bad like the humans are. We might just end up back in square one if this is the story about hosts becoming human-like and humans becoming host-like. I do really enjoy that reversal of, like, the humans becoming immortal like hosts and the hosts becoming free like humans. Maybe what we'll see at the end of this season is a situation very much like the beginning of the series, just with a reversal of roles. Would be cool. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up now-ish. It's an hour and a half. I really hope you enjoyed this stream. Chuck any last minute questions in the chat. But I enjoyed this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I think we're in the right place for a good season finale. All the pieces have been laid out in terms of Akecheta and his leading people to the valley and his sort of compassionate his compassionate role, whereas, you know, Dolores is the destructive Deathbringer who's determined to fight for host survival, whereas Maeve is focused on her personal relationship with her daughter and a desire for freedom, while William is embroiled in his whole sort of self-loathing issues based on his family past. And at the same time, I've got all these themes of heaven and hell and copies and realness and judgment, hellfire, which I'm excited to see come together in the finale. So let's call that a conclusion. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you so much for being patrons. And yeah, sorry again about this stream being delayed and a bit improvised, but I wanted to do something instead of no video at all. And I think we will figure it all out when the finale comes. We'll make a big video to make sense of the season, which I think will draw a satisfying conclusion to this series. So cheers, thank you all, and I'll see you next time. We'll post on Patreon to let you know what's happening with the last video of this series. Cheers, smash that bell. Yeah, thanks, Kenny. Alright, see you guys.